Historians, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? Perhaps when a tiny Spanish town wanted to make a war against Napoleon and his allies, and so declared war on Denmark. Only they forgot they had declared war on Denmark, and so did Denmark. And then in the 1980s, someone was going through records in like the library or something, and discovered, oh crap, we never actually made peace with Denmark. And so in the 80s, they finally made peace from their war against Napoleon in the early 1800s. Or maybe it's the tale of the army of Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein was incredibly loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, so of course when the emperor sends out a call for troops, the 80-man army of Liechtenstein volunteered. They went down to Italy and promptly saw almost none of the actual war. Instead, they hung out with an Italian baker a lot. When the war was over and they were being recalled home, they asked if they could bring said baker home with them. Their liege said yes, so they brought him back with them, and he served faithfully in the army until his death by natural causes. That's the story of how an 80-man army went off to fight a war and returned with 81 men. I would also rather hang out with a rad baker than go to war. But apparently that baker was then like, I'd rather go to war than be a baker. I'm Australian, and in the latter part of 1932, a wildlife management program happened and military action had to take place. So on the 2nd of November, war was declared on the emus. Locals attempted to herd the emus into an ambush. However, the birds split into small groups and ran so that they were difficult targets. On the 4th of November, Major Meredith had prepared for an ambush near a local dam, and over 1,000 emus were spotted heading towards their position. This time, they waited until the birds were at point-blank range before opening fire. By the 8th of November, only 6 days into the war, 2,500 rounds of ammunition had been fired. Considering so many shots were fired, the emu casualties were not great. The number of birds killed is unclear. One account claims just 50 birds, but other accounts range from 200 to 500. So a bunch of trained soldiers with machine guns lost a war against large, flightless birds. The Emu War. It's old news to me personally, but if you didn't know about that, it's kind of interesting. Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated in 1914 led to 9/11. The Archduke's assassination, of course, leads directly to the outbreak of World War I, which in turn results in the 1917 Russian Revolution, where Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize power in Russia and form the Soviet Union. Fast forward to the late 1970s, when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. In true Cold War fashion, the Americans help local groups to fight back and drive out the Soviets. One such individual who fought along in such groups, Osama bin Laden. A regiment in the Polish army adopted a bear after its separation with its mother, and named it Wojtek. This bear carried artillery rounds to the howitzer cannons, smoked cigarettes, and drank vodka with the men. Wojtek was considered a soldier by the Polish government and given pay for its duty. The regiment even made a new patch or logo of the bear carrying an artillery shell. Wojtek, I love Wojtek. The story of Wojtek's cool as hell. In World War II in the Pacific Theater, an American airplane was shot down by Japanese fire. There was only 9 survivors, and 8 of them were captured by the Japanese, while 1 of them escaped to sea. The 8 men who were captured by the Japanese were all tortured and killed in horrible ways, all of them dying painful and drawn-out deaths. The one who escaped almost died himself, as he was at sea for several days in a life raft with few supplies. Eventually, though, he was rescued by American forces and made a full recovery. He continued to fight in the war and survived through the rest of the conflict, and after the war he married and had several children. That man's name was George Herbert Walker Bush. Is there anyone else besides the Bushes that, had a child that later went on to also become president? In Monza, Italy, King Umberto I went to a small restaurant for dinner, accompanied by his aide-de-camp, General Emilio Ponzia Vaglia. When the owner took King Umberto's order, the king noticed that he and the restaurant owner were virtually doubles, in face and in build. Both men began discussing the striking resemblance between each other and found many more similarities. Both men were born on the same day of the same year, March 14th, 1844. Both men had been born in the same town. Both men married a woman with the same name, Margherita. The restaurateur opened his restaurant on the same day that King Umberto was crowned King of Italy, and on the 29th of July, 1900, King Umberto was informed that the restaurateur had died that day in a mysterious shooting accident, and as he expressed his regret, he was then assassinated by an anarchist in the crowd. What the actual hell? Is this like a fear and hunger friggin' mimic or something like that? Doppelganger? And yes, for those of you who know, I've got into the video games Fear and Hunger, and they are super good. I'm playing Terminus as we speak. But anyway, that is too many coincidences. I need to look this up.
World War I, more accurately, the descent into it. After the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, there were several attempts by ambassadors and diplomats to make peace, but obviously all failed. Starting with the assassination itself that occurred after several failed attempts earlier in the day, Gavrilo Princip's encounter with the Archduke only happens because the driver of the Archduke's vehicle takes a wrong turn onto the street where Princip is sitting outside a diner. Days after, a meeting between the ambassador from Austria-Hungary and from Russia to Serbia, intended to draft an agreement to prevent or limit military action, ends prematurely when the Russian ambassador has a heart attack and dies. Perhaps the war could have been limited to a German-backed Austria-Hungary against Serbia if it was known that no Serbian territory would have been annexed. If that was clear, Russia might not have supported her Serbian allies, but because the Russian ambassador to Serbia was dead, the only ambassador communicating with Russia was from Germany, and he doesn't know that Austria-Hungary wouldn't annex any territory. And so, Russia's full support is behind Serbia, as Germany's is behind Austria-Hungary. This means that, once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Germany has no choice but to do the same to Serbia's allies, Russia, France, and Belgium. And all three of those countries' allies return the favor unto Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire wakes up and joins on Germany's side, and so on. One wrong turn down a city street gets a ruler shot and killed, one peace negotiation falls apart by a chance heart attack, and one failure in communication drags two entire networks of alliances into war, regardless of whether or not any given country has any real stake in the inciting conflict. Not a historian, just a huge history nerd, but this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Let me tell you about the William D. Porter, a warship commissioned in 1943. It was mainly known for being the biggest dumpster fire in the history of oceanic warfare. Originally, it met up with the battleship Iowa, which carried FDR, who was going to Iran and Cairo for a summit between Allied leadership. The Porter's job was to escort the Iowa and ensure that no attack would befall on the president. When leaving port in Norfolk, someone didn't raise the anchor up all the way, which tore off a neighboring ship's railing and lifeboat mounts. The next day, a live depth charge went overboard and exploded, freaking out everyone aboard the Iowa. 2 days later, FDR wanted to see how well the Iowa can defend itself against planes, so the Iowa released a number of balloons to shoot at. Some drifted into the space of the Porter and, in a quest of redemption, shot the balloons down with no issue, after which all of the escort ships decided to do a drill with their torpedoes. The Porter tested, but somewhere launched a live torpedo straight towards the Iowa. The Porter then tried to tell the Iowa, "We may have shot a frickin' torpedo at you, move." But the whole escort commanded radio silence, so they tried using a signal lamp. But the operator told them that the Porter was just backing up. So rather than being held for high treason via incompetence, they broke radio silence and disaster was averted. It was at that point the Iowa told the Porter and its crew to F off back home. Eventually, the crew faced an inquiry over the incident and then were exiled to the Aleutian Islands, where everything went relatively well until a crew member came back to the ship, drunk off his butt, and wanted to play with the guns. The shot landed in the base commander's front lawn while hosting a party for other officers and their wives. Their tale ends during the Battle of Okinawa, where they were tasked with keeping kamikazes away from the bigger ships. One kamikaze plane darted straight towards the Porter and was shot down before the plane had reached the ship. Unfortunately, the plane was moving so quickly, when it hit the water, it carried just enough to the bottom of the Porter, detonated with enough force to take it out of the water and sink. It may not be weird, but my god, it's hilarious. I'm no historian, but my dad is. He made me watch a documentary about the Revolutionary War and the events that led to it for summer homework. Apparently, a younger officer was friends with a native chief called Half King, who was part of a tribe alliance allied with the British. The young officer and Half King were traveling through land as they walked into a group of Frenchies. Half King, eager to show his strength to the Brits, killed them all, but the Frenchies turned out to be an ambassador and/or dignitary. They knew that this would not go unanswered, so they built a small fort, but could not build the defenses enough, so they were overtaken by the French. The French made the young officer
signed the treaty on behalf of England, which was problematic because he struggled with French. He signed it, and the French waved it in England's face because it disgraced them. They couldn't let this go unanswered, so they had a war. The French and Indian War, which put the colonies in debt and thus increased taxes, which led to the Revolution. The craziest thing that caught me by surprise was that the young British officer in the beginning was George frickin' Washington. So the general who ended the American Revolution was the same guy who made the mess. I guess if you start something, you probably should finish it. Okay, this guy blames George Washington, but is no one over here looking at Half King covered in blood and frog's legs and the little ponytails that I think the French used to wear in the 1800s? I don't know, I'm just going off of what I saw in The Duelists, which is a really good movie. Go watch that film. It's Ridley Scott's directorial debut.
Smuggler's arm shark incident. In the 1930s, a large tiger shark was caught in Sydney and put into a public aquarium at Coogee Beach. The shark gets sick and a few days later vomits up a human arm while people are watching. The arm has a tattoo that the police are able to identify as a local gangster who is missing. The police track down his associates and get a confession and solve the case. Does anyone else remember that cartoon, Kenny the Shark? In 1949, the brand new U.S. Air Force orders the design and building of a supersonic jet bomber to be able to outspeed and outmaneuver Soviet air defenses and fighters. Okay, that's doable. Just one problem. The plane will be cruising supersonically between altitudes of 50,000 and 70,000 feet. If a person was to eject with a normal ejection seat and parachute, there's no oxygen and the air temperature is a balmy minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why jets are pressurized. The pilots and crew would promptly die by a combination of oxygen starvation and freezing. So the manufacturer comes up with a set of individual escape capsules for the crew with an integrated oxygen and pressurization system. Great! Except no one has ever done escape capsules on a US aircraft before. It has to be tested on something else before a human goes for a ride. Something else being alive at the time of the test and remaining so for the duration. Pilots have strict physical standards, and the US Air Force actually had a chimp colony for use in research and testing. Problem solved. Or not. Non-pilot aircrew have much less strict physical standards and can be a bit, well, hefty. The engineers have to find a heavier animal. Some genius whose name is lost to us came up with the idea of using juvenile American black bears to simulate the heavy weights of humans. Not surprisingly, a bear is going to have rather strong opinions about being taken out to a desert, shoved into a small capsule, and ejected from an aircraft traveling at Mach 2. The answer, of course, is to sedate the bear before they take their ride. Turns out, much like people, not every bear responds to sedation the same way. One young bear, upon waking up while being loaded into the escape capsule and surrounded by humans, got understandably ticked off and attacked one of the engineers. Despite the setback, the escape capsule worked and the B-58 saw active service from 1960 to 1970. Modern heavy industry due to one lousy deal. Treaty of Versailles ends World War I. Germany loses a great deal of its iron-producing regions in the agreement, but is left with a great deal of magnesium-producing regions. Magnesium is brittle and cannot be forged through impact like iron, so Germany develops the 5, 15, and 30-ton presses. Cue World War II. Allies shoot down German planes and see single, large stamped parts which improve strength drastically, while reducing weight, while Allies use smaller pieces bolted together. The US takes the 5,000 and 15,000 ton presses, while the USSR takes the 30,000 ton as war reparations. Improvements are made, large industrial parts are manufactured faster, cheaper, and stronger, triggering massive production of aircrafts, turbines, space shuttles. The Mester 50,000 ton press in Cleveland is still considered part of national security. Was built in the 50s under the heavy press program, and in 2008, $100 million was spent refurbishing it as it is that important. In 790, when the Viking Age began, Vikings set out to pillage and conquer England. They were very successful, but ultimately failed, except that in 911, the Duchy of Normandy was founded by a Viking named Rollo, whose grandson is William the Conqueror, technically still a Viking. Conquered England, and one of Rollo's daughters, I think, was married to the Duke of Aquitaine, which gave future English kings, whom were descendants of William and therefore Rollo, a claim on Aquitaine. half of France. So the Vikings came from a village in Scandinavia, terrorized England for a long time, only for a couple of Vikings and Rollo to get baptized and get some land right next to England, and his descendants to conquer England and start of the 100 Years' War. In hindsight, the raid of Linden's Fair ended in a 100 Years' War and bitter rivalry between the English and the French in a claim to the French throne, which ended only in the French Revolution, almost exactly 100 years later after the raid of Linden's Fair. I don't know what's going on with the person that wrote this, but it feels like they were drinking while they were writing this and just progressively getting worse and worse at writing and spelling as they went. It's honestly frustrating. But anywho, bloody Scandinavians, barbarians, the lot of them invading my country. Whew, not nearly as good as the Romans that at least had the decency to design our roads. Of course, they enslaved us and made us build them, but what you gonna do? Fairly similar to the Borneo cat drop in the 1940s, Mao Zedong implemented the Four Pests campaign. It was an event wherein the killing of typical agricultural pests earned rewards. At least they believed they were pests. The famines of China were caused by locusts and weevils, which were being eaten by the sparrows, mice, and frogs that the campaign advocated to be killed. Children would go into the field and return with strings of dead birds and mice killed by stones. Some regiments were introduced as well to monitor the presence of the pests, so that those who had realized the reverse logic would be fined for their misconduct. Another contribution to the reason why millions of people have died under communism. Senator Charles Sumner, making a speech on the U.S. Senate floor on May 19, 1856, denouncing slave power and insulted some U.S. senators, including Senator Andrew Butler. Senator Butler's nephew, U.S. Representative Preston Brooks, was so angry over the speech that he went into Sumner's office and nearly beat him to death with a cane on May 22, 1856. Then a couple of congressmen and senators responded by challenging Brooks to a duel. The irony is that Brooks died 7 months later from the coup after he attacked Sumner, while Sumner lived on as a senator for another 18 years. Have you heard of the Battle of Karanshabesh, where the Austrian army lost a battle to itself? The Austrians were looking to stop the Ottomans from capturing the town of Karanshabesh and thus marched into the area. Some Hussar scouts ahead of the army ran into some migrating Romani people who sold them some schnapps. When the cavalry were getting nice and drunk, the infantry ran into them and demanded to be given some alcohol. The cavalry refused, and during the ensuing argument, someone fired a shot. During the shootout between friendly cavalry and infantry, some people began shouting, "Torci, torci," which set off a huge panic in the drunken ranks of the Hussars. As the drunken cavalries are riding to their camp, the soldiers in the camp are panicking and shooting at whatever shadows are riding past them. A camp commander, in the meantime, also ordered a friggin' artillery salvo at the cavalry. The army is quickly dissolving into a mass of rooting men. The officers try to stop the panic, but they are shouting "halt" in German, and due to the multi-ethnic nature of the Austrian army, the orders were misheard as cries of "Allah" by Serbian, Hungarian, and Italian soldiers. All in all, the Austrian army lost several hundred men and had to retreat, while the Ottomans easily took Karanshabesh. And then I'm sure they took plenty of slaves and castrated them all, because that's what the Ottomans used to do. The Arab slave trade was frickin' brutal. Also, sorry if I mispronounced anything. The most interesting, at least to me, research I've done was when I was doing research on late medieval to early modern superstitions and the supernatural. I had to read a lot of almanacs from the 16th to 17th century. Almanacs are basically small booklets with a lot of varied information. They will typically also contain a history of the most important events of the past year. What's so interesting about this is that you'll read stories such as the city of Constantinople was attacked by a dragon, the fire claimed some casualties, but the horses were saved by the grace of God. While at first sight this just seems like a made-up story that nobody could ever believe to most of us, it becomes so much more relatable when you think about it from the perspective of the average European in late medieval Europe. The thing about the late medieval worldview in Western Europe was that it almost entirely revolved around Christianity. The world was seen as a duality. So while there was obviously some neutral scenery, almost every event and every living thing was seen as an expression from either God or the devil. Generally, humans were seen as divine and owning a soul, whereas animals could be anything.
What it usually boils down to is that they would be seen as divine if they were in some way a part of a biblical story regarding God, whereas they would be considered demonical if they were referenced in a story about Lucifer. Meanwhile, animals that weren't mentioned in the Bible were seen as neither possessing a soul nor being an expression of the devil, basically neutral. The question whether black people possessed a soul and were thus fully human and divine was a genuine theological question to Western Europeans at that time, seeing as they weren't mentioned specifically in the Bible. At least in the mind of late medieval Europeans, they weren't mentioned specifically, and it wasn't clear whether they were a part of the same divine creation like they were. So, in this case specifically, a dragon, which referenced the biblical snake, was the manifestation of the devil, while the horses surviving was the manifestation of God. What struck me the most about this is that so many things about medieval times are so completely foreign to us until you try to think about it from their worldview, when your world isn't understood through our current scientific interpretations, but instead is completely doused in this duality. Stories like these become so much more believable and relatable. What?
When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories. And if you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Linked in the description below.